Women's March in 2017. It was a big pink quilt that said women's rights are human rights and got a lot of attention. You can see that. You can also listen to her interview, all of them, that at justwannaquilt.com. So we quilt to get our message out, to be heard. And if it doesn't have to be big, and you don't have to be famous. Sid, my kid, made the following quilt in elementary school. We were asked by Coach D and art teacher Susan Holman to make a quilt for the New Orleans Anti-Bullying Quilt Initiative. And the quilt was just a paper piece, and it said, "Stand up and stop a bully." And then at the bottom of it, it was like a square quilt. So it says "Stand" and then "Up and Stop a Bully." And at the bottom, it had paper people in different outfit, like paper dolls almost, at the bottom. The quilt hung first at the New Orleans City Hall and then the New Orleans Contemporary Art Center. We dealt with bullying issues in 3rd and 4th grade, and Sid really took Coach D's lessons about bullying to heart. It was nice to translate that into a creation of a message in art. Together as a family, Sid, Ron, and I designed the quilt in its 24 by 24 inch entry. Sid is great, and she was only 10 at the time. At paper piecing, which is how we created the letters, and it's really remarkable in its accuracy, something I can't do. We created this the same year as our Boston trip for Mending Boston, when Sid was 10 years old. And family business. Quilting is filled with family businesses. Jaftex, the Stencil Company, Superior Thread, Martinelli, Missouri Star Quilting, and Quista Quilts, to name a few. Leah Day's family, along with Tula Pinks, Jenny Dones, and so many more, all work to support the family business. We saw it with Inventors too. The Block Lock, a ruler company focused on the construction stage of a quilt, was created by a husband and wife, as was Westerly Quilting Rulers, designed by another husband and wife team from Australia. All Brands, that has both 5 brick and mortar shops in Louisiana, along with a strong online presence, is also a family affair. For all of these families, quilting is their livelihood, either in whole or in part. Quilting is also filled with those doing it all. They started because of their love of quilting, and now they are running successful businesses that include teaching, products, and publishing. 4 generations. I had the pleasure of visiting Scott Fortunoff both at the Fabric Warehouse and his New York offices of Jaftex, a family-run fabric company that has been in business for 90 years at the time of writing, with 4 generations as part of that business. In their conference room hangs an 85th anniversary quilt with photographs from the family in each square, and specifically made fabric for the occasion. Jaftex includes the fabric companies Blank Quilting Corporation, Studio E Fabrics, Henry Glass & Company, A.E. Nathan, Fabric Editions, and Free Spirit Fabrics. The Historian. Quilting is filled with history, and there are many within the quilting world obsessed with understanding and cataloging that history, reproducing quilts from various time periods, and so much more. Tara Miller, Barbara Brackman, and Pam Weeks serve as examples of those who focus on history of quilting. Quilt history, whether it's through study groups, reading and writing books, appraisals, and the art of repairing, is a huge component of the quilt world. This could not be more evident than with the advent of major museums dedicated to quilting, including the New England Quilt Museum, the National Quilt Museum in Paducah, the International Quilt Museum in Nebraska, the San Jose Museum of Quilts and Textiles, Wisconsin Museum of Quilt and Fiber Arts, and Iowa Quilt Museum, to name a few. The Comforter. Many use their quilting skills to comfort others. Comfort comes in a number of forms. The baby quilt or the wedding quilt for a family member, friend, or colleague. Charity quilting for a cause. Memorializing someone through signature quilts or quilts made out of their clothing. Seth Hackler, remember him, quilting on a budget, made a quilt out of his mother's nurse's uniforms and continues to quilt in her memory. Beth Hennen Strand, made a signature quilt with a sawtooth star pattern when her husband unexpectedly passed away. Quilters spend an enormous amount of time thinking about others and creating and making comforting things to make their lives a little bit better. Camille Ainsworth and her mother Susan Ainsworth Smith make passage quilts. Ainsworth explains, passage or bereavement quilts are donated to local hospitals to be given to a family member of dying patients to help them give them comfort and in remembrance of their loved ones. We talked to many who quilt for charity, some at ferocious paces, like Amy Retzel and Becky Tillman Peterson. We talked to people who quilted for Project Linus, Quilts of Valor, local charities, foster kids, dog shelters, quilts for firefighters to carry and wrap around a child in need, and so much more. Charity quilting is an enormous part of the quilting world. One of my favorite interviews was with Janice Peachy, who foster cares the most ill of the preemie babies. And when they leave her care, she sends them with a quilt. We also not only make tens of thousands of quilts each year throughout the country, we also make them for raffles and auctions for charity. Carla Tramer of Quilts Beyond Borders and her team of volunteers make quilts for underserved kids around the world. Carla writes, "This is one of my favorites, she sent us a picture. This is one of my favorites, taken at a community school for needy children in Ethiopia. It was an amazing experience going there. The picture was taken on a day when we went to Kitchene Study Center. I'm the blonde in the blue raincoat hugging a little boy." The charity quilt cannot be understated. When we were asking for 2 to 3 images of charity quilting for this book and on our Facebook group, I had 70 comments and images within a few hours. Charity quilting, raffle quilts, and quilts put up for auction are an enormous part of quilting. The work of Shawn Kimber. Shawn Kimber's work, you know it from across the room. She fills her work with detailed, intricate piecing, powerful messages, and color. She uses quotes from life and from books. Sometimes it's just one word, and sometimes that word is naughty or controversial. She is brave in her choices and her politics. Shawn's work is known worldwide. Her famous work, the one for Eric G. from 2015, was acquired by Michigan State in 2016. She has been featured in the Wall Street Journal, the LA Times, Chicago Tribune, among other publications. She teaches us patience and slow quilting. She quilts in airports, in the silence at home, in the spaces between family and work as a professor and department head of math at Lafayette College. Since then, she's become a dean at Washington and Lee, I believe. I could be getting that wrong. Her pieces are also now, I think, at the Smithsonian. She's had a big couple of years. Let me take a look. Shawn's been a guest. I have something that we need to post. So you can look at her Wikipedia. She's Shawn Monique Kimber is an African-American mathematician and quilter known for expressing her political activism in her quilts. She was a professor at Lafayette College, which she headed the Department of Mathematics. Kimber is now a dean of the College of Washington and Lee University. She is really my all-time favorite quilter of all times in every way, and she knows that I'm like a super fan girl with her. Okay, so back to the book. The technique of hand piecing, her particular style, the use of quotes, the quilt itself, the idea of history, the history of our past, her control over where it is hung, and if and when it is sold, and so much more is what this book is all about. My hope is that by providing concrete copyright information, you, dear quilter and artist, will be brave and confident in your choices as you create your own work. I skipped one part. Her work is profound and beautiful, but for us, her work is more than that. Here, she uses a quote from Eartha Kitt's autobiography, Alone with Me. In essence, I am a sophisticated cotton picker. She explained to the Quilt Show that the piece is, quote, a direct callback to the make-do utility quilts made by her great-grandmother on a former cotton plantation in Alabama. So again, Shawn Kimber is very much in sort of her techniques and what she does are not protectable. We'll soon see this, but her quilts are. And her use of quotes is important to figure out how we understand that with copyright. You can do that. But also just the beauty of her work is and something to be really admired. And it's true of many quilters. Okay, let's get back to the text. To a kid. It's almost done. Quilters and copyright law. To understand the role of law within the creative process of quilting and other arts, we have to identify what we do. Only then can we begin to ask the legal questions and understand our creative activities in relationship to copyright and other laws. When we are sewists, we buy patterns and kits. We make them. We might give them away. We might keep the final product. We are following the pattern. If we sell the final products, it's our sewing efforts, the actual physical act of sewing the fabric together that people are paying for, not our design. Why? Because we don't own the design when we buy the pattern. When we buy patterns and kits, are there legal restrictions on what we do? Yes. Can we sell our end product versions? There are competing thoughts about that. We'll talk more about that. What happens if we change the pattern or choose different colors? It depends on how much, but merely changing the color, no. It doesn't change the copyright. Does this create a new copyright on the quilts? Depends on a lot of elements, and that's what we'll be looking at in this book. What is our relationship to the original copyright? That is the subject of this book. When we are artists, we create patterns, we create quilts. They are masterpieces, they are mundane. We use traditional blocks, we experiment, we improvise, we use different techniques. Questions. What resources can we legally use to create? That's what this book is about. What can we be inspired by? All sorts of things. The question is, how close is that inspiration to your new work? What are the building blocks of our culture? We'll be exploring that in detail. What happens when others are inspired by our works? Depends on how inspired. How can we protect our works? Many ways. We'll explore that in this book. What happens if someone copies our work or if we're accused of copying someone else's work? We'll get to that. That's what this book is about. When we are inventors, we invent and make tools that help our quilting endeavors. Sometimes we patent these. Sometimes we make businesses based on the inventions. Question. How do we protect our inventions? Usually through patents or trade secrets. We'll see. We can take a look at just one of patents. It's one of our new books, and we're revising it for a major publishing company. How do we get our inventions out into the marketplace? That's entrepreneurship. What inventions are not protectable, and what do we do if your invention falls into this category? Branding comes into play. You can look at that in our book, Just Wanna Trademark for Makers, a new version coming out very shortly. But also with inventions, a lot of things that we do, techniques and other things are not protected by patents. And we'll talk more about the distinction between something that is patentable and something that is not. We create businesses. When we create businesses, we are pattern makers. We are long armers. We make memory quilts. We finish bindings. We design fabrics. Our businesses are sometimes part-time, sometimes full-time. Our businesses are sometimes run by one person, multi-generational families, or sometimes a huge corporation. Questions. What happens to the importance of copyright when something is being done as a business? We will look at commercial versus non-commercial use in this book, and it's super, super important. Does it change the stakes? Big time. When we quilt for charity, for strangers, we put our time into quilting for strangers, for causes for the sick, for the homeless, for the lost and the hurt, for joyful occasions, and in memorial. Question, can we use any patterns for this activity? Yes. Well, you can personally use the same pattern as many times as you like, but copyright enters if you're making copies of the pattern that you did not create for others to use. Question, does charity give more freedom within copyright system? Nope, not necessarily. We'll talk more about that. When we quilt for our families, at key moments in our families' lives, we quilt. Births, birthdays, weddings, anniversaries, graduations, sickness, death, memorials. Question, how does copyright impact on what we make and give away to our friends and families? Non-commercial uses like this have more freedom under copyright. We'll learn more shortly. But most of the time, if you're giving something to your families, it's fine. Does this change if our families hire us to make the quilts? As sewist